So recently, I mean, Oprah Winfrey's been talking about childhood trauma as being something that we should be really focused on nowadays. And childhood trauma, it seems to be quite a popular theme nowadays, and that psychological problems, mental illness stems from childhood trauma. What's your views on that?
Yes, I would suggest that, I would agree with this premise that if there is childhood trauma, um, a lot of problems will occur for the adolescent and the adult. Childhood trauma is extremely destructive. There may be exceptions where extremely resilient personality may tolerate it and not decompensate, not fragment. But invariably, childhood trauma will lead to a degree of fragmentation, a large degree of pain and turmoil in later life, in relationships and being happy in your own self. So, childhood trauma is extremely relevant and important, especially when relationships are so fragile. So a child can be exposed to various parental figures in a brief period of time for brief periods. So may be exposed to somebody who has no love for the child, or a series of people who have no love for the child, and may experience abuse from those people. Child may experience abuse from biological parents as well, but it is compounded by the fact that child can experience emotional, physical, and sexual trauma from strangers who come into the this sort of role that they may get. So the other thing with childhood trauma is that although extended families do inflict that trauma, but in majority of cases, or in many cases, extended families are also a buffer. So if family is also broken, the nuclear family is broken, the extended family is broken, so child has no grandma to go to, or auntie to go to, or cousins to go to. And so if it somebody in the family who's abusing, and if there is nobody else, and the other parent is refusing to accept, or is so dependent on that relationship that denies or goes into a rejection phase of the child's complaints or child's experiences, then where does the child go? Childhood trauma can cause PTSD, it can cause autism like features, it can cause all sorts of behavioral disorders, delinquency, depression, anxiety, lack of confidence, OCD types, and so on. But and the longer the trauma goes on, the longer this torture will carry on, will become part of one's psyche,
So
one's
isn't
construct.
it paramount and very important that childhood trauma is recognized early?
Yes,
And so that's when the intervention can take place
that's it.
and the child could perhaps, rather
Get
than
a
suffering from another 10 years of it, when it becomes solidified,
absolutely.
they can. What do you think needs to be done for that? Because that's not something that's really being focused on.
As I was, when we were discussing this earlier, as I said, that child is not the source or the person who can deal with it. Child is uh, helpless, has not the energy, the ability, and the wherewithal to identify it and deal with it. It is primarily two aspects of child's life: the educational and the familial, or the home and school, where this can be identified. It cannot be identified elsewhere. So if abuse or whatever is going on at home, then the school must pick it up. if it is happening at home and both the parents or both the carers aren't involved, then the other must pick it up. So it is extremely important that our default position should be that we should be constantly aware of what is going on with the child. That should be the default position.
And any warning signals should be taken
Any
seriously.
change in attitude, change in behaviors, withdrawal, upset, delinquent behavior, destructive behavior, self-harming behavior, drug-related behavior, and so on. Because it could be peer-related, that there can be abuse happening from a group of peers. There can be abuse happening and bullying happening at school. Severe depression can lead to self-harm and suicide, severe depression, and constant anxiety related to school. So parents should be able to pick it up, or at least one parent should be able to pick it up. And any behaviors at school where the child is okay at school, happier, but doesn't want to go, or doesn't want, always trips on the stairs when going home, always has one issue or another. So anything that is out of the ordinary, anything which is out of the ordinary for the child before and after, because you need to have a pre-morbid description of the child. So because if the child is exactly the way he is now, the way he was 2 years ago, there is no pre-state and the post-state. So there is no line that you can separate. But of course the parents can do that. The mother can tell the teacher if the teacher is constantly seeing delinquent behavior, withdrawal behavior, timid behavior, anxiety, or whatever.
I think it's important for schools to start taking on that role.
That is it.
Because that is where often children, I remember from my state school, I remember when I was in junior school, we had some girls who just would have to leave the class because they were crying and they had a lot of problems in their houses.
Yeah.
But there was nothing further that got done.
Yeah.
But it was very identifiable within the school classroom.
And the other thing is that we did talk of the Asian families, didn't we? That the Asian families are still in a time warp from 1950s and 60s and 70s when they came to England, and their value system is exactly the same. It hasn't moved from 50s, 40s, 60s.
No assimilation.
No assimilation, no attitudinal change. And because they experienced racism, they experienced discrimination, so they kind of, created those value walls around them, the ethical walls, the familial walls. They created that little castles and little communities and protected each other. And so that's where, the issue is that the environment is hostile, so let's all have a siege mentality. And the siege is also that they have to send their child to school, but still they won't engage with that school. And then, if mothers have to engage with schools, the problem is that generally the first generation never spoke English. Because if they were going to be sticking with their values, mums were staying at home, or maximum wearing their chadar and going and doing the shopping in a local shop which spoke their own language. And everything is looked with hostility. But it is changing in the second generation, and it is changing in the third generation, and it must change. And that is one problem, that Asian parents need to engage more and more with schools.
One of the barriers was the English. For many immigrant families, their English isn't so good, they're not confident.
No.
And they don't like to feel inferior.
But obviously, the thing is that we are emphasizing more so on those who came and were vulnerable in a host community, and where they faced discrimination and racism and so on. But obviously, it's not entirely their fault, because they were like those same children. That they came into this environment which was hostile, and they have to adapt to it, and they have to survive. And how do you survive? You survive by protecting yourself, wearing an armor. And that's what they did. So although we may criticize it, but there is a clear understanding. There is a rationale behind it. That why did they do it? They did it because the local community was not welcoming